pleased to be here. This is my first year attending this Jews and Race Symposium, though am I close enough?
Not if you turn more than a day off.
Though I've heard about it, and it's really a phenomenal event that does not take place anywhere else. To have this kind of conversation, to have an engagement with community, so it's really special and a real opportunity to be involved in this. What I wanted to do in my talk is to try to contextualize a little bit about Jews and demography. I called my talk Counting Jews, and what I'm interested in exploring a little bit is understanding what I really see as a kind of Jewish obsession with counting themselves, with quantifying, with surveying. So part of this is sort of an attempt to excavate historically to understand where that impulse comes from, and then to think about the history of it as related to questions of community definition today and how Jews continue that kind of tradition. So I want to start by talking really briefly about an article that appeared in the Jewish Exponent, which is the Philadelphia Jewish newspaper that has, I think it's been around for about 125 years. And the title of the article was, "It's Time to be Counted. Plans Underway for 2009 Jewish Population Study." And it announced a major population study that the Jewish Federation of Greater Philadelphia was going to sponsor. And it described the study as such. The study will address important questions about Jewish identity and affiliation, patterns of mobility, household characteristics, socio-demographics, and population estimates. And the results, which I think are supposed to come out relatively soon, have been sort of the buzz in the community. You know, what are we going to find out about ourselves through this? And really, the sort of subject of my class is exactly why do Jews find it so important to be counted? And the argument that I am making is sort of simple, that by counting themselves, I think Jews hope that they can make themselves count. And the project of creating these kind of social, scientific, and survey portraits of Jews is a project of defining community. And it's not simply, of course, a snapshot of the present, it is rather more of a vision for the future. So there are sort of three topics I want to address today, and all of them in sort of irresponsibly brief fashion. One is the sort of historical roots of this obsession. The second is the kind of ideologies enacted in Jews' fascination with their own demography. And the third has to do with the kind of ways in which this project of counting themselves is fundamentally a kind of existential project for Jews. So that's sort of where I'm going. So let's start a little bit with the kind of historical roots. So obviously this 2009 Philadelphia Jewish population survey is not the first of its kind. The first national United States Jewish population study was in 1972, but we can start much earlier than that. In fact, the Book of Numbers, and I hope you'll indulge me, I'm not a Bible person, but I've read it. So the Book of Numbers begins with what? Why is it called the Book of Numbers?
It's a census.
Right, it begins with a census, right? And so what it says, and this is from really the first verse of the Book of Numbers. This is God speaking to Moses in Sinai. Take a census of the whole Israelite community by the clans of its ancestral houses, every male head by head. So what's the purpose of the census? Well, it seems to be to find all the eligible men who will be able to bear arms, right, to enact an army, and also for tax purposes. Rashi, an 11th century commentator, offers a sort of more transcendent interpretation, saying that God wanted to count all of the Israelites because they were so dear to him. Right? So why do people count? And the lesson maybe from this is that in the midst of creating and reconstructing community, as the narrative of the Book of Numbers is really about, it's important to understand who that community is, right? People count themselves. They want to understand who they are when they're going through that kind of process. It's a way of thinking about boundaries, and it's a way of thinking about power, I think. Okay, so to move a little bit ahead in history, talk about the Enlightenment, which is really the kind of root, I would argue, of Jewish obsession with demography and with counting themselves. And there are two important Enlightenment traits to really think about in understanding the development of social science and of surveying. And these are general traits that then I'll kind of connect back up to Jews and their interest in surveying themselves. The first of the traits is a sort of movement toward greater empiricism and rationalism, right? You'll remember from your European history classes that the Enlightenment is this impulse to rationalize the world, right? To quantify, to have a kind of empirical way of thinking about life as holding the answers to all questions. So that's the first. And the second is this interest in humanism, right? In universalism. What is it that connects all people, right? How is it that we're all alike? But the flip side of this question presents itself fairly quickly, especially given the kind of increasing global contact that people are having during the Enlightenment, which is also, why are we so different? Well, Jewish intellectuals, of course, some of them really become very immersed in this Enlightenment movement. They see it as a kind of pathway toward modernity, toward acceptance, toward citizenship. And they create their own movement, in a sense, in hopes of enlightening and modernizing Judaism. And there are all sorts of products of this, and we could sort of talk forever about this. One is that really the kernel of every modern movement of Judaism, whether we're talking about the most traditional or the quote-unquote least traditional, has a point of origin in the Enlightenment. But three things, I would say, coalesce, sort of come together to dictate how this Enlightenment context and Jews' fascination with the Enlightenment comes to then produce this fascination that Jews start to have with demography and with counting themselves. So there are these three things, right? One is the beginning of a kind of academic approach to studying Jews and Judaism. And this is directly out of a kind of Enlightenment context as Jewish intellectuals are saying, we want to be taken seriously by the modern world. We want to prove that Jews are not atavistic, they're not clannish, they're not a primitive people, they're a modern people. So we need to then scrutinize ourselves according to these kinds of modern categories, right? So a kind of famous group of German Jewish scholars create this Wissenschaft und das Judentum group to study the scientific study of Jewishness, to really start to put Judaism and the Jewish people up to the kind of standards of Enlightenment study. At the same time, you have the early development of social science. So you have strides being made in anthropology, developing as a discipline, sociology, linguistics, right? These sort of modern ways of knowing developing at the same time. And you also have Jews starting to form what might be thought of as Jewish defense agencies in the 19th century, right? Jews recognizing that despite these Enlightenment promises, anti-Semitism is still continuing, right? Despite emancipation, despite the fact that Jews are gaining citizenship, anti-Semitism is still a reality in their lives. And deciding that this moment of fascination with empiricism and rationalism might offer a way of fighting that anti-Semitism, right? To try to wage a rational case against it. And you have the creation of these defense agencies, right? These groups that are going out and trying to identify where and when anti-Semitic incidents are happening and trying to fight them. And the method that they use really draws from a kind of Enlightenment ideal of rationalism and empiricism and draws from the developing social sciences, which is that they start to study and try to figure out where Jewish population centers are, what the characteristics of Jews are, and use these portraits as a defense against anti-Semitism, essentially to prove that Jews are like everyone else, right? So you have all of these efforts starting in the 19th century, Jews to survey themselves in an attempt to really show that Jews can fit into the modern world, that there's no reason that Jews should be treated